Hi, I'm Pranamya and you're watching Pages of the Globe. Alright, so if you're new to my channel, basically every single day I read stories, I tell you a little bit about the author, and then I give you an analysis about them. We have a lot of fun on my channel of like 100 subscribers. Before you scroll away and you're like, oh, I don't want to see a 10-year-old, talking about stories and giving me her analysis about it. A, I'm not 10 years old, I promise. And B, I do have an intro video pinned up on my channel that tells you a little bit about myself. But if you don't want to watch it, I can promise you that I know how to read stories and give good analyses about them. The story that I'm going to be reading today is Désirée's Baby by Kate Chopin, and it's very, very interesting. So without further ado, let's get on with the story. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the author, though, and just a quick rundown of the story. Alright, so Kate Chopin was born in 1850 and she died in 1904. She was an American author known for her pioneering work in feminist literature. Now, some key facts about her were, first of all, she was born in St. Louis, Missouri, and she was of French and Irish descent. She attended the Academy of the Sacred Heart in St. Louis, which was a Catholic boarding school, where she developed a love for reading and writing. Now, after her husband's death in 1882, Chopin began writing as a way to support her and her family. She published her first poem in 1889, and over the next decade, she wrote numerous essays, short stories, and even wrote 2 novels. Now, some of her major works were The Awakening, published in 1899, which was her most famous novel, The Story of an Hour in 1894, which we have actually read on this channel before. It is a very interesting short story about it's basically a woman's reaction to the news of her husband's death. And it kind of highlights themes of identity and freedom. And if you want to check that out, I would totally recommend it. It's so interesting. Now, one of her biggest works was Désirée's Baby, which we will be reading today, published in 1893. It's a short story that addresses issues of race, identity, and specifically in the antebellum South. Now, as for her literary style, Chopin's writing is known for having very clear prose, vivid descriptions, and she focuses often on women's inner lives and their struggles. She often explores themes of female independence, identity, and sexuality. Although she wasn't very widely recognized during her time, Chopin's work was sort of rediscovered in the 20th century. She is now celebrated as a forerunner of modern feminist literature, and her works are studied for the rich portrayal of women's experiences and their challenge to societal norms. Her influence continues to be felt in the contemporary literature and feminist theory area, and her works remain widely read and analyzed. Now, specifically about Désirée's Baby, I don't want to spoil too much, so I will tell you just a little bit. It's set in Louisiana before the American Civil War. So if you didn't know, in specifically Louisiana, many French people resided there, because in the Louisiana Purchase, I don't know if you guys have ever studied American history, but if you did in school or wherever, you would know that the Louisiana Purchase, which was kind of like the Louisiana land, was purchased from France, from Napoleon. So there were a lot of French people living there. And the story is about Désirée, this young woman who has unknown parentage because she was adopted by a very, very rich French family named the Valmont family. They were very wealthy. And it's a very poignant and thought-provoking piece that raises important questions about race, identity, and the nature of love and acceptance. Without further ado, let's get on with the story. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which story you would like me to read next. Désirée's Baby by Kate Chopin. As the day was pleasant, Madame Valmont drove over to La Brie to see Désirée and the baby. It made her laugh to think of Désirée with the baby. Well, it seemed but yesterday that Désirée was little more than a baby herself. when Monsieur, riding through the gateway of Valmont, had found her lying asleep in the shadow of the big stone pillar. The little one awoke in his arms and began to cry for Dada. And that was as much as she could do or say. Some people thought she might have strayed here of her own accord, for she was of the toddling age. The prevailing belief was that she had been purposely left here by a party of Texans, whose canvas-covered wagon, late in the day, crossed the ferry that Cotton May kept just below the plantation. In time, Madame Valmont abandoned every speculation but the one that Désirée had been sent to her by a beneficent Providence to be the child of her affection, seeing that she was without child of the flesh. For the girl grew to be beautiful and gentle, affectionate and sincere, the idol of Valmont. It was no wonder when she stood one day against a stone pillar in whose shadow she had lain asleep 18 years before that, the Armand Aubigny, riding by and seeing her there, had fallen in love with her. That was the way all Aubignys fell in love, as if struck by a pistol shot. The wonder was that he had not loved her before, for he had known her since his father brought him home from Paris, a boy of 8 after his mother died there. The passion that awoke in him that day, when he saw her at the gate, swept along like an avalanche, or like a prairie fire, or like anything that drives headlong above all obstacles. Monsieur Valmont grew practical and wanted things well considered, that is, the girl's obscure origin. Armand looked into her eyes and did not care. He was reminded that she was nameless. What did it matter about a name when he could give her one of the oldest and proudest in Louisiana? He ordered the corbeille from Paris and then contained himself with what patience he could until it arrived, and then they were married. Madame Valmont had not seen Désirée and the baby for 4 weeks. When she reached Le Brie, she shuddered at the first sight of it, as she always did. It was a sad-looking place, which for many years had not known the gentle presence of a mistress. Old Monsieur Aubigny, having married and buried his wife in France, and she having loved her own land too well to ever leave it. The roof came down steep and black like a cowl, reaching out beyond the wide galleries that encircled the yellow stuccoed house. Big solemn oaks grew close to it, and their big reaching branches shadowed it like a pall. Young Aubigny's rule was a strict one too, and under it his black men and women had forgotten how to be gay, as they had during the old master's easy-going and indulgent lifetime. The young mother was recovering slowly and lay full length in her soft white muslins and laces upon a couch. The baby was beside her upon her arm where he had fallen asleep at her breast. The yellow nurse woman sat beside a window fanning herself. Madame Valmont bent her portly figure over Désirée and kissed her, holding her an instant tenderly in her arms. Then she turned to the child. "This is not the baby," she exclaimed in startled tones. French was the language spoken at Valmont in those days. "I knew you would be astonished," laughed Désirée, "at the way he has grown, the little cochon de lait. Look at his legs, Mamma, and his hands and his fingernails, real fingernails. Zandrine had to cut them this morning. Isn't it true, Zandrine?" The woman bowed her turban head majestically. Si, madame. "And the way he cries," went on Désirée, "is deafening. Armand heard him the other day, as far away as La Blanche's cabin." Madame Valmont never removed her eyes from the child. She lifted it and walked with it over to the window that was the lightest. She scanned the baby narrowly, and then looked as searchingly at Zandrine, whose face was turned to gaze the fields. "Yes, the child has grown, has changed," said Madame Valmont slowly as it replaced it beside this mother. "What does Armand say?" Désirée's face became suffused with a glow that was happiness itself. "Oh, Armand is the proudest father in the parish. I believe chiefly because it's a boy to bear his name, though he says not that he would have loved a girl as well. But I know it isn't true. I know he says that to please me. And Mamma," she added, drawing Madame Valmont's head down to her and speaking in a whisper, "he hasn't punished one of them, not one of them since the baby is born. Even Négrillon, who pretended to have burnt his leg so that he might rest from work, He only laughed and said Negrillion was a great scamp. Oh, Mamma, I'm so happy it frightens me. What Désirée said was true. Marriage, and later the birth of his son, had softened Armand Aubigny's imperious and exacting nature greatly. This was what made the gentle Désirée so happy, for she loved him desperately. When he frowned, she trembled but loved him. When he smiled, she asked for no greater blessing of God. But Armand's dark, handsome face had not often been disfigured by frowns since the day he fell in love with her. When the baby was about 3 months old, Désirée awoke one day to the conviction that there was something in the air menacing her peace. It was first too subtle to grasp. It had only been a disquieting suggestion, an air of mystery among the blacks, unexpected visits from far-off neighbors who could hardly account for their coming. Then a strange and awful change in her husband's manner, which she dared not to ask him to explain. When he spoke to her, it was with averted eyes, from which the old love light seemed to have gone out. He absented himself from home, and when there, avoided her presence and that of her child without excuse. And the very spirit of Satan seemed to suddenly take hold of him in his dealings with the slaves. Désirée was miserable enough to die. She sat in her room one hot afternoon in her peignoir, listlessly drawing through her fingers the strands of her long, silky brown hair that hung about her shoulders. The baby, half naked, lay asleep upon her great mahogany bed that was like a sumptuous throne with its satin-lined half-canopy. One of Leblanche's little quadroon boys, half naked too, stood fanning the child slowly with a fan of peacock feathers. Désirée's eyes had been fixed absently, sadly, upon the baby, while she was striving to penetrate the threatening mist that she felt closing about her. She looked from her child to the boy, who stood beside him, and then back again, over and over. Ah! It was a cry that she could not help, which she was not conscious of having uttered. The blood turned like ice in her veins, and a clammy moisture gathered upon her face. She tried to speak to the little quadroon boy, but no sound would come out. At first, when he heard his name uttered, he looked up, and his mistress was pointing to the door. He laid aside the great soft fan and obediently stole away over the polished floor on his bare tiptoes. She stayed motionless, with gaze riveted upon her child, and her face the picture of fright. Presently, her husband entered the room, and without noticing her, went to a table and began to search among some papers which covered it. Armand, she called to him in a voice which must have stabbed him if he was human, but he did not notice. Armand, she said again. Then she rose and tottered toward him. Armand, she panted once more, clutching his arm. Look at our child. What does it mean? Tell me. He coldly but gently loosened her finger from about his arm and thrust the hand away from him. Tell me what it means, she cried despairingly. It means, he answered lightly, that the child is not white. It means you are not white. A quick conception of all of this accusation meant for her, nerved with unwanted courage to deny it. It's a lie. It's not true. I'm white. Look at my hair. It's brown. And my eyes are gray. Armand, you know they are gray. And my skin is fair. Seizing his wrist. Look at my hand. Whiter than yours, Armand, she laughed hysterically. As white as Leblanche's, he returned cruelly, and went away, leaving her alone with their child. When she could hold a pen in her hand, she sent a despairing letter to Madame Valmond. My mother, they tell me I'm not white. Armand has told me that I am not white. For God's sake, tell them it's not true. You must know it's not true. I shall die. I must die. I cannot be so unhappy and live. The answer that came was as brief. My own Désirée, come home to Valmond. Back to your mother who loves you. Come with your child. When the letter reached Désirée, she went with it to her husband's study and laid it open on the desk before which he sat. She was like a stone image, silent, white, motionless after she placed it there. In silence, he ran his cold eyes over the written words. He said nothing. Shall I go, Armand? She asked, in tones sharp with agonized suspense. Yes, go. Do you want me to go? Yes, I want you to go. He thought Almighty God had dealt cruelly and unjustly with him, and felt somehow that he was paying him back in kind when he sapped thus into his wife's soul. Moreover, he no longer loved her, because of the unconscious injury she had brought upon his home and his name. She turned away like one stunned by a blow and walked slowly towards the door, hoping he would call her back. "Goodbye, Armand," she moaned. He did not answer her. That was his last blow at fate. Désirée went in search of her child. Sandrine was pacing the somber gallery with it. She took the little one from the nurse's arms with no word of explanation, and descending the steps, walked away under the live oak branches. It was an October afternoon. The sun was just sinking. Out in the still fields, the black men and women were picking cotton. Désirée had not changed the thin white garment, nor the slippers which she wore. Her hair was uncovered by the sun's rays, brought a golden gleam from its brown meshes. She did not take the broad, beaten road which led to the far-off plantation of Valmont. She walked across a deserted field, where the stubble bruised her tender feet, so delicately shod, and tore her thin gown to shreds. She disappeared among the reeds and willows that grew thick along the banks of the deep, sluggish bayou, and she did not come back again. Some weeks later, there was a curious scene enacted at L'Abri. In the center of a smoothly swept backyard was a great bonfire. Armand Aubigny sat in the wide hallway that commanded a view of the spectacle, and it was he who dealt out to half a dozen black men and women the material which kept this fire ablaze. A graceful cradle of willow, with all of its dainty furbishings, was laid upon the pyre, which had already been fed with the richness of a priceless layette. There were silk gowns and velvet and satin ones added to these, laces too, and embroideries, bonnets and gloves, for the corbeille had been of a rare quality. The last thing to go was a tiny bundle of letters, innocent little scribblings that Désirée had sent to him during the days of their espousal. There was a remnant of one in the back of a drawer from which he took them, but it was not Désirée's. It was part of an old letter from his mother to his father. He read it. She was thanking God for the blessing of her husband's love. But above all, she wrote, "Night and day, I thank the good God for having so arranged our lives that our dear Armand will never know that his mother, who adores him, belongs to the race that is cursed with the brand of slavery." The end. So that was Désirée's Baby by Kate Chopin. Before I jump into a full analysis, I'm really just going to do a quick summary. In the story, we see the protagonist, Désirée, who is named because her arrival as a lost child gave this childless couple what they desired the most. So it's not really Désirée, it's more desire, I guess. But anyway, she's raised on this rural plantation in Louisiana, and it's pre-Civil War. And she grows into this sweet young woman. This very, very wealthy young man named Armand falls in love with her. And even though people warn him that, hey, we don't know who her mom and dad is, we don't know her background, he still gives her everything because he's so deeply in love with her. And soon an heir is born. And we learn that he gave her everything. He's quite a mean-spirited man, especially towards his black servants. But when Désirée comes, he's much, much kinder to them. And he just has, a better countenance overall. Now, once the child arrives, they're very, very happy. But a few months later, she starts to notice that, something's off, Désirée. Because people are visiting from, literally anywhere. People she doesn't even know that well, just to look at this baby. And Armand is very, very rude. He's acting so rude to all the black servants. And he doesn't even look at Désirée nor their child. He doesn't even interact with them. Now, one day, Désirée realizes that her child is black. Her child looks to be of African American descent, and she is shocked. She starts shaking because, of course, it's the worst thing in the world if your kid is black. Obviously, you have to understand that at the time, that was sort of the mentality, and she's just shocked. She doesn't know what to do. So she talks to her husband, and her husband's like, "Well, the kid's black, so you must be black." And she's like, "No, that's not possible. I have brown hair. I'm whiter than you. I'm paler than you." But he's like, "Well, I'm definitely not black, so you must be." And later on, she writes to her mom, and her mom is like, "You know what? You just need to come home." And so after that, Armand agrees. He's like, yes, you need to leave this house. And she walks out with her child, and she's just wearing a gown, and she's taking her child with her. And we see that she doesn't take the road normally to her house or to her mother's house. She just walks into the bayou, and she's never seen again, suggesting that she drowned herself and the baby rather than bring shame upon herself and her husband. Now, later on, we see that Armand is burning Désirée and the baby's possessions, and he's burning these love notes that Désirée wrote him as well. But he sees that there's this one much older letter. It's stuck in the back of the drawer, and when he pulls it out, he realizes, oh, my wife didn't write this, so he reads it, and he's like, oh, it's from my mom to my dad. And in it, he learns this like the huge plot twist that happens literally at the very end. And we learn that Armand's mother, who died when he was a child, had written to his father that she's happy that Armand will never have to know that she is black, and thus she and he, because Armand is half black then, belong to the race that is cursed to live with the brand of slavery. And that the very racism that drove Armand to abandon his wife and his child and Désirée to kill herself and her son is the very same racism that would have punished and exploited him had his true ancestry been known. The same way he punishes and exploits those enslaved on his plantation. After all, Armand notes much earlier in the story that Désirée is as white as La Blanche, and his comment suggests Désirée could just as easily have been in La Blanche's position, and the twist at the end confirms so could he. And this is such a powerful story to me, because it really just has this whole story to me about how race is almost like a social construct, because it's so ironic that we see Armand, this incredibly racist guy, later learn that he himself is half black. Now, looking at the historical context of this, to understand the plot, it's very important to recall how people in pre-Civil War South, because this is in Louisiana, and most of the United States, honestly, viewed race and heredity. When La Blanche is referred to, or someone says, oh, La Blanche's son, it's referred to as such as it is like Désirée's recognition that her son resembles this boy who serves in her house and may in fact be her son's half-brother, that forces the story to its tragic conclusion. And these further distinctions include octoroon for people whose ancestry was thought to include 1/8 African heritage. And these purity of bloodlines mattered to white people living in the South in Kate Chopin's time, and it mattered deeply to the white characters in Désirée's Baby. After the abolition of slavery, light-skinned people who had some African ancestry sometimes were able to quote-unquote pass or move through society as white people could, avoiding the discrimination so prevalent in post-war South. And if they were discovered or even suspected of attempting to pass, however, outrage and punitive consequences might follow. The entire topic of racism, specifically in the South pre, post, and during the Civil War, is always a very touchy topic, but we often see that there was a lot of hate and discrimination around that time. Not to say there isn't now, but especially then. And so the story really provided this strong message about, and this clear critique, honestly, of how the unfairness and hypocrisy of this rigid race and class-based society that her characters and we ourselves live in. And I think that is such a powerful message that was delivered so beautifully in Désirée's Baby. And it's a story that we read in high school or maybe even middle school, and it is because this message was so important during this specific time, and it was published in Vogue, and it made some big waves. Even now, we see every time students read this story, they sit back and they're like, oh my god, he just made his wife kill herself and her baby because he thought she was black, but it turns out he was. And obviously now it's like hard to be like, okay, but why does it matter so much? Like, the baby probably doesn't even look dark skin, considering he's only 1/4 black. But we still see that there's so much of this like narrow-mindedness in the story, and it genuinely makes you sad at the end to see that such a beautiful love that Armand had was destroyed because his hatred for those of the race that he himself is in was too great. Applying this to kind of now what's happening, I will say something that I found was sort of relatable when I was reading through like different blog posts about the story, and someone was talking about how he hated people that were in his own race. And to me, that kind of reminded me of how we often talk about things like internalized racism and whitewashing, where one kind of rejects their own culture and race, even though they know they are part of that race, and they prefer to go in with the more like quote-unquote acceptable whiteness. And while I'm sure that's not what this story was trying to say, that's not what the message of this was, I think that is an important interpretation that you can make of it, especially in this time. Another very quick comment I wanted to add, I don't know if any of you guys ever caught on to this in the story, but oftentimes like Armand was labeled as this tall, dark, and handsome man. I mean, they always, like, when Désirée was referring to him, she said that his beautiful dark face didn't have frowns or something. And so he does have a dark countenance, but because maybe he is white passing, it never occurred to him that like, hey, maybe I'm black. And then obviously because he comes from such a rich family, there is really no chance that you could actually, dispute his ancestry. Anyway, that's it for today. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and comment down below which short story you would like me to read next. Bye!